Okay, so then again, because you just all saw me a little bit earlier, I'm Goudreau, co-founder of ArcBees, and I'll be talking to you how to improve your productivity using GWTP, but more importantly about design pattern and architecture, and why we did the way we did GWTP in itself. Why is there a transition into my presentation? Anyway. So the motivation behind GWTP was that we wanted something that was scalable, maintainable, and extensible. And something that we could really rely on when we were building an application that was going to scale up to dimensions that, that were just too big for a small framework or for just doing anything that is not structured into a web application. So we've worked with businesses that had hundreds of developers working through GWTP, and having them care about how to write things in a structured way helped them a lot into being able to scale their teams as well as their own application. So a couple of architecture principles that we use behind GWTP are the solid principle that Uncle Bob popularized, the MVP pattern, as well as iterative and incremental development. Does any one of you have seen the talk that Julien Dramet did? No one. One? Two? Which one, right? There was several. The one on the best practices of ArcBees. Yeah. So iterative and incremental development is one of the things he spoke about. I won't go into the details here and go over what he did or anything, but just that every single decision that we've made so far behind everything we did for GWTP and all our products are aimed directly at those three principles. And the trend. And I wouldn't go too far into good best practices around architecture because there are just too many good practices to talk about today. But let's focus on the ones that was driving on GWTP. So every single web application that we're building, almost all of them, I recall maybe two that weren't using GWTP that we've made for clients, but we were still building MVP frameworks for them to help them structure the code that they were written, whether they were using activities and places or something, or not even activities and places. We're also using ResDispatch, which is a JAX RS implementation for REST services. It's based on the command pattern, so you can use like well, first question, does any one of you guys use the dispatcher, RPC dispatch itself? So RPC dispatch was one of the first product GWTP dispatch that we've built. It was a fork back in the day, 5 years ago, of another product that we were using really strongly, but that product just went down in the sense that the contributor that had created the product didn't contribute to it anymore, so the community just died of it. So we forked the product because it was a great one, and we decided to implement some more functionality for security and stuff like that. And then we introduced it with GWTP dispatch inside GWTP itself. So we've been using that for we had used that for a couple of years. There's a lot of users that use it. It's a great product, but it's cumbersome at the same time because you have to write action and result classes for each single call that you want to do to your backend. And the other caveat is that it has to be tied to your server. So you need GWT server to use RPC. And we wanted something that was agnostic for the client and the server. And we were starting to build more and more REST API for the server for some of our clients and decided to use ResDGWT at the time. ResDGWT is a great product, but we were used to the command pattern where we were able to build efficiently client-side cache, right, and using local storage or intercepting some of our calls that we were doing to the server to do even more with it. So going down that road, we decided to do our own implementation of JAX-RS, which is now the ResDispatch, which use almost the same syntax as the RPC dispatch so that our user is not, the current user of RPC can migrate to it. And that doesn't use any of those action and result class that we were using for the RPC. So we completely remove one of the hassle of using RPC through the dispatcher, to the dispatcher. And then another tool that we're using since the early beginning of the implementation into GWT is GSS. So even before it was introduced into GWT, Julien Drameix was doing his own branch on his own GitHub repository that we were using into production. And that helped a lot to build what is GSS today because we were using it into real situation and then made it possible to write the exporter, the converter, and also find some bugs in it that would occur once we would merge to GWT. Since then, there has been a lot of improvement in it, and those three pieces are the cornerstone for everything that we do on the front end. Also, GSS is a great tool for normal web developer. What I mean by that is that GWT developers are developers that care a lot about, as David said, I like what he said about that, abstraction and tooling. CSS, is there anyone that is can really say here in the room that are expert in CSS? One? So, two? So there's not a lot of those into the GWT world. And why? Probably because Sass, Less, and all the good stuff that normal web developer use to write CSS doesn't really exist into the GWT world. And while we were using CSS resources, it was even, it was even more cryptic to someone that is used to write CSS to write good CSS. There was a lot of CSS functionality that wasn't existing, as well as a lot of the goodies of those library like Sass that weren't possible to use. And hence the use of GSS, which bring up all the CSS3 functionality and not all the goodies that they need, but that will be next into our timeline. So why am I talking of those three products when we're talking about improving the productivity while writing GWTP apps? Is because it introduces the right patterns, not only to design the visual to your application, but also how to communicate with the server and how to structure your code. And this is, even if you're not using GWTP, this is really important to make sure that your team is using structured pattern and reproducible pattern so that anything that can be implemented the same way over and over and over. When you build a really big code base, that becomes even more important because you will have some new member in your team that will need to learn what everything's about. And if everything is written differently into your web application, you will end up with even longer learning curve. And again, the long transition. So let's talk a little bit more about the MVP pattern. I always go back into the past and say that back in 2009, one of the reasons why the MVP pattern was introduced to the GWT community rather than MVC, for example, that is used among every single web application. Well, you have the MVC in .NET, you have MVC into Spring Framework, you have the MVC, that pattern is everywhere. But the problem with that pattern is that the view isn't passive. There's some responsibility with MVC, with the view in MVC that cannot be used. Well, they can be used into GWT, but the problem is if you're doing TDD or you want to heavily unit test your application, it slows down the test results. So hence the MVP pattern. What we want is a view that is as passive as possible so that you can easily unit test every single collaborators in your presenters without having to use GWT test case. So back in 2009 when Rick Cromwell did this presentation, it was mostly to encourage developers to write easier tests and faster tests. Fail fast and you'll get something quickly out of it. So the presenter. What's this all about? Let's take a look at a presenter within GWTP. One of the first things that you will see on each class is that an application, a presenter extends presenter. This is the root of your application. This is something that we want to remove into GWTP 2, by the way. I'll talk a little bit more about what we're working to make this even easier for you to write presenters, view, and everything in relation. But let's look at what it is right now. So application presenter, extend presenter, and then you define a view for that presenter. You don't have to define it into the presenter itself, but we usually do it because it's a one-to-one relationship, so it's clear what is the view of that presenter at that moment. And there's a proxy. This is one of the most boring things to write in GWTP. So for those of you that are using it, I understand you, and I agree with you. And why hasn't it been introduced into GWTP? It's because of code splitting, actually. So this proxy is is being generated by the GWT.create generators, and it enables code splitting your web application into subjects. So you can use bundles, application bundles. You can that can refers to several presenters together, and then this part of the application will be code splitting from the rest of the application, reducing the initial JavaScript load. So code splitting was introduced in GWT 2.0, and that's where we came up with a proxy solution to be able to easily introduce code splitting through presenters. You also have content slot. What you need to understand within GWTP is there new users into the new possible users of GWTP into the room right now. All right. So the content slot itself is a way to show nested presenter. It's GWTP worked with a hierarchical tree. So the leaf, which is the page that you want to show, will be inserted into a parent presenter, another one, and so on. Here you see the application presenter. The application presenter is the root of my application. What I will usually insert into application presenter is a top-level menu and nothing in it aside of that. What I will have is a slot that will contain each pages that I want to show to the user. And then you have the usual lifecycle function on reveal, on bind, on hide, on reset, and prepare from requests. I'm not going into all the details of this, but it is really important to understand what it does, and I will come back a little bit later on the lifecycle events, what they do when they are called and why. So now the view. So the application view in itself, extend view, an implementation of view, it's only, you don't have to extend it, it's just that we overridden some of the methods so that if you implement view, you don't have to re-implement all the functions. So there's a lot of little goodies into the Vue MPL that lets you remove a little bit of the code that you have to write. We have added also in GWTP 1.4 the possibility to hook on into event like unattach and undetach. If you're using GWT.query, this is really useful because you need to, when an element is removed from the DOM, the event is also removed from the DOM. So if you had attach your event at the beginning, at the initialization of the widget, for example, you will end up having to reattach them. So that's why unattach and undetach is really useful in those cases. So this is a new functionality that we added. We also have the set-in slot. Set-in slot is called when the leaf presenter wants to be revealed into the parent. So this is where you will tell GWTP in which panel you will be adding the widget. So one other best practice that we're using and that improves a lot of our productivity is to use UI Binder. And this is also one of the reasons I was talking about GSS. In our team, we have a CSS expert that doesn't really play with the business logic of the application, but that really care about how things look and how it would be rendered to the user. And this is where it shines when we do when we do collaborative work. It's really, they know their way around with the Vue, they know their way around with the client bundles and stuff like that, and they can really give you this little visual excitement that you don't get with when you don't really know what you're doing with your CSS. And while you can do good, a good result with CSS, well, you have to care about cross-platform, you have to care about mobile, responsive design, and if you're an expert at what you're already doing, well, it's a little bit hard to do everything, to be expert at everything. So the model itself is really passive in itself. Well, unless you do domain-driven development, the model in GWT will do nothing. Well, at least in the type of programming that we do. So it's just getter, setter to objects that will go through the wire. I'm just saying this is the simplest expression of what you could get an ID and a set ID of a dashboard, for example. I removed all the fields. The point is the model can be more than just a POJO, but it really depends of the pattern that you're using. I know a lot of people that are using domain-driven development successfully, and that is really, really well formed. But you have to have a strong team that knows their way around to do that. So as for yourself, we use passive models, passive POJOs, and everything is done through either collaborators to the presenter or the presenter itself. So I was saying a little bit earlier that I was going to talk a little bit more about the GWTP lifecycle. So it starts with a user request. It starts with a name token into the web link that you have into your browser. Then it goes into the GWTP registry to search the presenter that needs to be shown, which if the presenter is null, that means that there's a proxy around waiting for the presenter to be instantiated. And once, if it's already there, it will call onBind. Well, sorry, this graph is not quite good, right, actually. It's not if it's, okay. Maybe it's me that just seeing that backward, but well, basically if the presenter has never been bound, it will call onBind. And if it has been bound, it will never call onBind again. So you can unbind manually your presenter if you want. In some cases, it's really useful. For example, when you have dynamic tabs, but at that point, you can't use your proxy with that. You need to create custom proxies so that you can create dynamic tabs that are bound to name token in each one. We've built a system similar like this in the past, and well, while it's not the usual use case, if you wish, you can also do tabs with custom tab with parameter requests and stuff like that. But, well, you will never unbind your presenter manually if you don't have that type of use case. And then, if the presenter was already visible, it will call directly on reset. If not, it will call on reveal, and then on reset. So both of them are being called at the first time around. If you're doing the place that the onBind should be used always to instantiate and add event handlers to your presenter. So when you wish to add event handlers, or you need to create some widget or something with a factory, for example, it is the onBind that you will do all the initialization process of your application. I almost never do requests to the server in onBind unless it's something that needs to be done only once. The call to the server, if you have implemented client-side cache, for example, is safe to be done into the onReset. Else, it's usually done in onReveal. Is there any question about the lifecycle at this point? I didn't talk about onHide and onBind, basically, but you have two more lifecycle events that you can hook on. Yes? Previous data? Yeah, so that's one of the reasons is because onReveal is called before onReset, as you can see. So if you're cleaning the data in onReset, well, that's why you're seeing it. But you could reset the data in onHide instead. onHide is called when you change from one place to another, and that the presenter is being hidden into the system. So you can do that when you hide the presenter will be the best place to clear everything, so that when you come back to that presenter, there's nothing into any field. On onBind, unless you're using custom proxies and dynamic tab, for example, a CMS could be a good example of that, because the user will basically create pages with name tokens dynamically. So if you want to create presenter dynamically with their own name token, well, that would be a good example of where you could need custom proxies. And when you need to unbind the presenter, because they will use the same proxies, the same presenter basically. So you need to unbind him when you hide it and then rebind it and so on. When you close it, sorry, the page, not when you hide it. And then some tips. There's a lot of events going on into the view in itself. And the usual way that you, back in the days, maybe 3 years ago, the way that most people were doing MVP is that they would have had a reference, for example, say that you want to add a click handler on a button. So the add click handler would have been done through the presenter, through an interface called add click handler. Most GWT button has this, most GWT element has this click handler thing. So you would reference to the view, into your view interface, has click handler, had click handler, and then in your presenter you would have the click handler. So that was the way of doing it. That was most people were doing it that way. Then come UI handlers, which is how we call them, because what we want to really expose to the presenter in the view are only UI handlers. You don't want to do action on the presenters. You only want to send event back to the presenter. So instead, rather than adding the click handlers into the presenters, you can use @UI handler that the GWT platform, the GWT toolkit already proposed, and then you can call your presenter and send it the information that the cancel button has been clicked. And then the presenter would decide what to do. So you have a bidirectional communication between the presenter and the view, so that you can send back up the event itself. That removes a lot of boilerplate code, by the way. If you use that practice, you remove a lot of boilerplate code. And the danger of what I've seen into some of the projects is that people were starting to reference directly the UI element like button into their view interface to add click on the button. And this is really a bad practice because if you have a reference of button into the presenter, that means that your presenter cannot be unit tested anymore. So that's not the design goal that we wish to have. And then use the event bus. Well, use it smartly because if you're having too much event, you can, for example, I have a great example actually. When I say smartly is that sometimes you use event when you have a one-to-one relationship between a presenter and maybe not a presenter. In this case, it was a column initializer, a class specialized to initialize the column of a cell table. And the developer used an event to send that, for example, if there's a button to click into a cell column, to send back to the presenter that it has been clicked. But this introduced a little bit, if you're using the same column initializer into another view, for example, so you're using the same cell table, you end up with this event being thrown twice. So even if the cell table in page A is not shown to the user, it will catch that event. So you need to be careful what is the purpose of your event. But if your event needs to be catched, it's like a saved event of some settings, and there's a lot of place into the system that needs to maybe answer those events. Well, use the event bus in those cases. So make sure that you don't use callback basically or localize event bus observers rather than always using the event bus for everything. I even saw in the past people, you know, the has click ender, they were registering the click event from the UI into the event bus. So the click event itself, unless you were testing for if the source was the one that you were expecting, were thrown to all the handlers that was listening to click event. So you were clicking on page A, and page B that was listening also to click event will receive it as well. And that introduced a lot of complexity. And use collaborators. What I mean when I say use collaborators is try to keep your presenter as simple as possible. When you can extract some of the logic of the presenter into a new class so that you can isolate that class and test it with unit tests and make sure that your presenter is as simple as possible to understand for each developers in your team. So I'll show you a little bit more, a little bit of code for UI handlers and presenter. So the way that it's used in GWTP is that you have an interface, say called feedback UI handlers, that extend UI handlers in itself. So perform mail, maybe not the right word, but it's more like an on-click perform something. So then it sends the feedback object, which is in this case it's because it's using the editor framework from from GWT. So basically, when you flush the data, you send that back to the presenter so that it can perform whatever it wants to do with the feedback object. And then you have to do two things to be able to implement the pattern. Is that first you need to implement to your presenter the feedback UI handlers interface that you just created, and then you would call get view that set UI handler this. There's also one thing missing into this where the view has to implement as UI handlers and the type feedback UI handlers to be able to set the UI handlers to the view. So then the view implementation in that, faster now. So basically, you just have to implement since my view implement as UI handlers, well, you'll be able to have access to the perform mail feedback function. Yeah, we introduced it into GWTP a class that you can extend that will let you have access quickly to the UI handlers itself. So then it boils down to a one-liner to call the presenter when you click submit button. So the event bus in itself, most of the time, I try to implement a pattern where the source is always included into the fire method. So if you have to validate that the event is coming from the right object, you always have access to the real source of that object. This is also the pattern that is used behind GWT when you think about click events and every single event that are being thrown by the GWT widget. So we implemented exactly the same pattern for events in GWTP that is in GWT. So you shouldn't be too destabilized by that. So the event itself, fire, there's always a static method to fire the event from this, which is the class from which it's being called. All presenters implement as handlers, which end up being calling the event bus that fire event from source, which is the presenter, then the object that you want to throw over the event bus, and the event that you want to throw on the event bus. So a little example of a collaborators, of a collaborator, for example. We're using, when you want to unit test some behavior into a presenter or a collaborator that use GWT itself, it can become a little bit struggling because, well, GWT use a lot of code generation and magic behind the scene that can't be unit tested. So this collaborator is just a location facade where I hook on the GWT history item for some and GSM for others, but it gives me a little bit some access to some of the functionality of the framework that I can then mock into my unit test. ResDispatch. So as I said a little bit before, ResDispatch is aimed to be a JAX-RS fully JAX-RS implementation. It implements the same command pattern as the RPC dispatch, and we aim to do the simplest implementation possible, so that you don't have, so that you have to as less code possible to initialize your ResDispatch call. So, as a bonus, you can get also information about the response. And we built an extension to ResDispatch because while we were working on ResDispatch, we rewrote almost all the code generator into GWTP so that they can be extensible. So we wrote, as an example, an extension to GWTP ResDispatch, which are the res delegate. What it does is that you don't need any more dispatcher and then you call the service, for those of you that are used to use RPC dispatch. So you basically inject into your class resource delegate the service that you want, and then you call whatever you want to call. The only problem with that is that it's not type safe. So that's why we extracted it from GWTP. It's for users that know what they're doing around, but the resource delegate hides the type of it behind, so you really need to be careful when using the res delegates. But at the same time, it reduces a lot of the code that you have to write to call a single service. You don't need the dispatcher anymore. So be careful. If you have an error, probably because the type of what you're using is not the right one. So how to set up ResDispatch. So this is basically into a service module that include the two things that you need to set up. Well, first you need to install the ResDispatch async module, and then you need to bind the host page to the REST application path, which will be used into the class generated for ResDispatch. And then you have to inherit into your GWT, your GWT resource this line, delegate resource delegate. That is if you're using resource delegate. Else you need to include the you need to include ResDispatch instead of resource delegate. This is really important. I've made those two lines together because since GWTP has an order fix for the generation of the code, the ResDispatch, the generation has to happen before the MVP entry point. Do you guys remember when there was no MVP entry point into GWTP? Yeah. There was a lot of code to write to be able to, the ginjector in itself. You needed a reference to each single presenter, and then had async provider if you were using proxy code splitting or not. There was a lot of problems that that were coming up into our forums just because someone forgot a line of code into the ginjector. So when we released 1.0 of GWTP, we decided to build generators that will basically remove the need to write a ginjector. But introduced the other question, because some people wanted to play with the ginjector, and we made possible to extend the ginjector and give that ginjector that you were extending to our code generator. But and you don't need to write an entry point anymore while using the MVP entry point. So it removed almost all the hassle of setting a new project in GWTP. I'm saying almost because there's still a lot of things that we can do to improve the way you write presenter in Vue and make it even easier for the developer to get started on. So the usage is very simple afterward. You can use a simple interface with the path to your services. Use the JXRS specification to do the annotation of your class. And this dashboard service used a resource delegate. So this dashboard service can be used on the server as well, in a sense that if you're using REST-easy, for example, from JBoss, well, it uses exactly the same syntax to write the interface. So you can now share the resource interface from your server to your client. So it can be in the shared folder, for example. So that was one of the design goals. At first, it wasn't possible. And then when we introduced the resource delegate, we were able to finalize this last step of our design goal for ResDispatch, which was to provide a fully compatible JXRS implementation, as well as to be able to support already existing services. And then the part where you call the services goes with dashboard service with callback. So it resembles a little bit the RPC services from GWT in terms of simplicity. And the part that is not, this is the part that is not type safe, basically, the hand here, the hand part here. So you could say that this is a group, for example, instead of dashboard, but you would still be able to get by organization ID. So this is the part where you have to be careful when using it. Whoa, sorry. All right. So let's go to UI design. We want to improve we wanted to improve our productivity, and CSS was one of the problems that we had. It was giving us a hard time each time that we wanted to play into that ground. And we didn't have best practices or things like this for GSS or GSSS. That's when we started to hire CSS expert. So it improved not only a lot our own productivity, but the end result to the clients were astonishing. So that's one of the pieces. And for that, because we have now people that knows what they're doing around, we built GSSS on steroid. So from their feedback, we built a tool for their needs so that they can be more productive while using GSS with GWT. And we want to go further than that, a lot further. GSS doesn't implement nesting classes into the CSS, which is one of the most used features nowadays into CSS when you're using a tooling like Sass. And this is one of the things that we want to do into the upcoming release. Contribute directly to GSS, which is used behind GWT, and make it possible to use some natural features that are already out there for those CSS experts. And naturally, UI binder. Well, you may not realize, but it's really near HTML. You need to be able to write those integrators need to be able to introduce HTML and CSS as if it was HTML template. And UI Binder lets you do that, actually. You just have to have a HTML panel of the root, which you can change the tag of the root to whatever you want. Like HTML panel can be a hey, a heli, a li, can be a nav element, can be anything you want. You just have to set the tag of HTML panel, and then you can write whatever HTML you want in it. And then you can use GWT.create to bind on those HTML elements and reduce a little bit the footprint of your application, because behind the GWT widget, there's a lot of event handlers that are being bound and introduced that you may not even need into your application, but that are there anyway. So one of the key to have a really fast application is to remove as much as possible your GWT widget and use plain HTML and CSS3 to do your manipulation. So a little bit of GSS example. As you can see, there's a lot of imports in there. There's the mix-ins, colors, because we define colors with variables. Mix-ins is a part of GSSS. Geometry is just something that we imported into the application, and the main style sheet is the style.gss. And then we imported the grid resource, the grid system from GSS, and you can find everything that you can do on the website, the documentation. I can show you that. Oh, I'll pass on, but all the functionality available for the mix-ins, the grid system, and everything is available on the dev website. So this what resemble a plain CSS file with the require for the color geometry GSS mix-in and mix-in rounded 4px. For example, this will be translated into 4 lines of CSS that goes through all type of browser basically. So it removes a lot of hassle for CSS to write CSS. So what's next? Well, we aim at continually improving GWTP and all our products, but we want a full JAX-RS coverage. I was saying that it was our aim, and we're nearly here. There are some things that are not yet complete. We're working currently on a project that requires XML and custom serializer, deserializer through ResDispatch, so this is one of the priorities that we will work in the next few weeks. And we want a new way of writing presenters, because we want it to be even simpler for you guys to use and to be able to write code that is where you get as soon as possible to your business logic. We already started a complete generator rewrite for extensibility within ResDispatch, but we didn't rewrite the whole proxy generators yet, so we still have some work to do in that region. And then push state. There's already an extension that Johannes has written back in the days for push state that you can use in GWTP, but we want to make it part of the framework now. So I invite you, there's a complete roadmap that I invite you to see for what's next in GWTP. It has been written in collaboration with the community, and if there's anything that you wish in or any comments that you have, you can consult this document. The presentation will be available on the GWT.create website, I think, so anytime, any comment will be appreciated. So this is kind of just not complete, but what we think when we think about simplifying the way that we write presenter. There's too many annotation to my liking, but it gives you a sense of, there's no presenter extension here. You don't have to extend anything. And then you have the unbind, unreveal event being bound through annotation rather than overwriting some protected methods into your root. So with that, we could do the exact same thing as what was without it, basically. And we could be backward compatible as well. That's the good news behind this. Because basically what this will generate is a class that is exactly the one that we used to write, but without the hassle of writing all the boilerplate. So this ends my presentation. There's, I think, 5 minutes for questions, so you're welcome.